Hey guys, even here with the old school abs, and in this video we're gonna talk about the bodybuilders who overcame a genetic weakness. Now, before I made this video, I was thinking about how I'm gonna title it, and the first idea was bodybuilders who overcame bad genetics. But then I just couldn't bring myself to title a video like that, because if I'm talking about them, if I know about them, obviously they didn't have bad genetics. And in this video I'm going to be talking about the bodybuilders who were top 3 or even winners of the Mr. Olympia show. So not bad genetics at all, but they had to fix some imbalances. They weren't just perfect from the get-go and they just had to grow and get leaner. There is a lot of guys like that. So I'm going to mention a couple of them first. The guys with like perfect genetics pretty much, who didn't have to work on anything specifically, just to grow. Perfect examples would be like Flex Wheeler, Chris Cormier, Kevin Levrone, Kai Green also, Ronnie Coleman too. He just needed time to grow and, to get lean, or actually to start using steroids, since he's claiming to be natural in 1995. So imagine that. So many guys, a lot of them, they were just blessed with great genetics, but there were other guys who were also great, really great bodybuilders, but they had a genetic weakness. And for that weakness, some people told them that they won't be Mr. Olympia winners or top tier bodybuilders. However, they worked on it and they fixed these things. So we're gonna start with the earliest age of bodybuilders, and we're gonna start with the very first Mr. Olympia winner of all time, Larry Scott. Now, as I said before, all these bodybuilders had absolutely great genetics. So did Larry, but his weakness was a bit wider waist. He didn't have much of a competition, right? He didn't have too many competitors to compare himself against, but he had a weakness, and again, that was his waistline. It was a bit wider than what would be considered ideal. So what did he do? He grew pretty big arms. Yeah, he was known for biceps and overall big arms. He invented the Scott curl, the preacher bench curl, and now we call it Scott curls as well. So he grew arms, and another thing that he did, and this is creating an illusion of wider shoulders or just overall width, that's he grew his forearms. So he had pretty big forearms, and when you have big arms and big forearms, you seem wider. Of course, he probably worked on his shoulders quite a bit, but he didn't really make them too big, unlike bodybuilders from today who grow shoulders to look like cannonballs. Guys back in the 60s didn't have really the technology to do that, So he grew his forearms and arms, and that created an illusion of a little bit smaller waist, which was small enough to win the Mr. Olympia, right? There is the next guy, who is also from the similar era, from the 70s, and also 1998 winner, Mr. Olympia, of course. I'm talking about Arnold Schwarzenegger, the probably most famous bodybuilder of all time, who had the same problem, but also a couple of more. But that was the biggest problem, his waistline. His waist was wide. Period. His waist was wide. What did he do? Of course, he grew insanely big arms, big lats and everything. He tried to grow legs as well. I'm going to talk about that in a second. But what he did the most, and what basically was the main reason for him actually hiding that big waist of his, was the way he was posing. He was twisting his body a lot. And that's how he hit it. And he also did the vacuums. He would hit vacuum in so many poses, and that would make his waist seem smaller. So he overcame that. But also Arnold had a couple of other genetic weaknesses, such as calves. His calves weren't big when he started, but he grew them. He just trained them. He trained them like a maniac. There were some rumors that he had calf implants, but I don't believe in that. I believe that you can grow calves if you just train them like a maniac, like every other body part. There are so many people I know who are like, no way, bro, you can't grow calves if you don't train them hard, and they just don't even train them, and they don't have calves at all. So you need to train them quite hard, and Arnold is a proof of that. He grew them. His legs, his quads, and thighs overall were never his strength, but that wasn't really that big of a deal back in the 70s. The judges weren't paying so much attention to legs. So thankfully he was lucky enough to be born in that era. So that wasn't much of a weakness, but yeah, genetically he didn't have great legs and triceps too. So he didn't have great triceps, but he grew them, There are people who are like, if you don't have a bicep peak, you can never have a bicep peak. It's genetic, you don't need to train it hard. And if that was the way of thinking Arnold had, his triceps would be much worse. he never believed in that. He just gave all of his, and he believed that he's gonna improve every single body part that was lacking. And so he improved every single one. Now, of course, he always had much better biceps and triceps, much better chest than anything else, but everything else that was lacking was improved. So, yeah, that goes to show that you need to train hard, whatever it is. And again, Arnold was an absolute genetic freak. Like, nobody had biceps and chest like that ever, even today, I might even say. Probably the best biceps and the best chest of all time till this day. So he was an absolute genetic freak, don't get me wrong, but he had a couple of weaknesses. He worked on them, he fixed them, and that's why he's one of the greatest of all time. Next one I wanted to mention was Tom Platz. Now, Tom Platz has the best leg genetics in the history of bodybuilding till this day. Nobody had legs like him, nobody has legs like him, and nobody probably trained legs as hard as him. So that's one of the reasons, but also he had great genetics, not only for building the leg mass, but also for squatting. He was able to squat very, very heavy and to throw himself down, and basically most people would destroy their knees. However, his knees were made out of steel or something like that, so he could squat very heavy, but his upper body wasn't matching his lower body, and that was his weakness, his entire upper body. His arms were a bit smaller, his chest was decent, yeah, it was pretty good, but back was also thick, but he didn't have the width, he had weak shoulders, the waist also wasn't super small, so upper body overall genetics weren't so great, but he realized, hey, I have great leg genetics, so let me just push them to the max. And the legs weren't as appreciated back in the day. Still, he was a top 3 guy. He was one of the top guys, and he remains one of the biggest legends of all time because he has the best legs in the history of bodybuilding. So he overcame the weakness of having a weak upper body, so he pushed his lower body. He didn't want to have a balanced physique and be average bodybuilder. He wanted to have the best legs in the history of the bodybuilding, and that's why he's one of the legends. Would he place higher if his legs were a bit smaller and he had more balance? I don't know. It's a question. Probably not, maybe. But anyways, he wouldn't be a legend that he is right now if he didn't train his legs so hard and if he didn't have those kind of genetics. The best legs in the history of the world. Rich Gaspari. Now, this guy, he didn't have the best shape to his physique. I don't think he had the single body part that was very well shaped. I didn't like his arms, I didn't like his quads too much. His back also didn't look that aesthetic. Chest overall, he was veiny a little bit too much. But how did he overcome his shape weakness? He did that by getting super peeled out of his mind. He was shredded. He was the first guy. He was the bodybuilder that introduced shredded glutes to bodybuilding stages. He was the one, yeah. Christmas Tree also, he basically, Samir Bannout did it also very well, but this was the next level. So he was peeled, he was shredded. He realized, I don't have the best shape, I don't have the best genetics, but I can grow and I can suffer as hard as possible, and I have good genetics for losing fat, so I'm gonna come as sharp as possible, and that is why he was placing so high. It wasn't the shape, it was the conditioning. This brings me to a very important point that I kind of skipped at the beginning of the video. I wanted to mention it, but I wanted to clarify what good genetics in bodybuilding are. But I'm sure most of you guys already know. So there are a couple of things. The ability to build muscle fast, symmetry, not just two identical sides, but also when you say symmetry, it refers to the proportions, the balance of the physique. When you talk about the genetics, there is also the ability to lose fat fast and not lose a lot of muscle with it. And there is also the shape of your muscle bellies, pretty much. And there is another thing, probably the most important one, it's skeletal structure. So the size of your wrists, the size of your waist. The skeletal structure is going to determine how your muscle is staggered all over your body. So it's probably the most important feature. For example, if your clavicles are short, your chest isn't going to be super wide, you're not going to be super wide on your shoulders, and so on and so forth. There is a couple of metrics. So let's go with the next bodybuilder I wanted to talk about, and that is my favorite bodybuilder of all time, Mr. Dorian Yates. And I hate it when people say that he didn't have good genetics. I hate it because in my opinion he had the best genetics in the history of bodybuilding. And he wasn't perfect. He had so many imperfections, but all those imperfections made his physique Perfect, in my opinion, in my eyes. I just liked his physique very much. Now, if we're gonna talk about specifics and the way judging criteria is, then yeah, you can say that he was lacking quite a few things. Or you can just easily say that he had only 2 really good body parts. Everything else was just mediocre if you talk about a shape or development compared to the rest of his good body parts, or those 2 body parts that were obviously his back and his calves. Now, his arms were trash compared to his back and calves. His biceps were not big, not too big, and they had very poor shape to them. Not peaky, not even too long, kind of short and not peaky, just bad biceps. And also he tore one of them very soon in his career, in 1994. So biceps pretty bad. Triceps, in the side tricep pose they look decent, but there weren't super full triceps like, for example, Kevin Levrone had, or Flex Wheeler. No, that wasn't a good tricep, man. No. Shoulders, also pretty weak shoulders, let's be honest. Chest, pretty shallow. I mean, he knew that. He agrees with everything that I say right now. He talks about that as well. Quads, not the best shaped quads. Those weren't very well shaped quads, not super separated. He had huge medialis, but not too much of a sweep, not too many details all over them. Not really good quads. Hamstrings were okay, I guess, nothing special to them, not too big glutes, right? Compare them to Ronnie's glutes, like not that good glutes. He had back and he had calves, but how was he able to beat the other guys? It was obvious. You can say that he had small arms compared to his back, but his arms weren't small compared to the other guy's arms. He was bigger than all of them. He had everything bigger than them. His chest wasn't the best chest if you just look at his chest. But, take the mass of his chest and measure it against the chest mass of Sean Ray, for example. It was bigger. Everything was bigger. He was just bigger than everybody else. And plus, he was more conditioned than everybody else. And also, he had super crazy developed back like nobody had ever, pretty much. Him and Ronnie. That's it. That's the 2 best backs in the history of the world. I guess you could put Phil Heath somewhere in there, but no, Dorian was better than Phil in my opinion. So he had the best back in the history of the world. He was bigger than everybody else, and he was always the most conditioned guy on the stage. So he overcame quite a few weaknesses, quite a few flaws by coming bigger and more shredded. And that was his genetic strength. He was able to grow so fast, and he was also really smart. He really had he had great intuition. He had a lot of knowledge that nobody had before him. He was the first one going into the unknown, so he pretty much invented a lot of things that most bodybuilders are implementing today. He was the first. He was the first masked monster. Nobody else before him was that big. Nobody was able to tell him what to do because nobody knew how to get there. He was the first. So that's why I find him the best bodybuilder of all time, and also because of the shape. Not all years, of course, but 1993 version of Dorian Yates, that's just perfection in my eyes. I also wanted to mention Milo Shardchef. Now, he tried to overcome his bad genetics in terms of having smaller arms and a little bit smaller calves by taking a shortcut, by using Synthol, actually. He says that somebody from Dorian's crew, or Dorian himself, gave him Synthol, and he was told that Flex Wheeler was using, I don't know how many, but many cc's of this stuff in his arms. Milos did the same thing. He injected a lot of stuff in his arms and in his calves, and it resulted with having much bigger arms and calves, but he lost the shape. So it didn't really work well for him. It's not the best example of overcoming the bad genetics, but he tried, and it was an obvious attempt, but it is questionable if it was a success or not, because in 1999, at the British Grand Prix, he placed very well. He placed 5th, beating Marcus Roll, for example, and some other really good guys like Nasser El Somebody, Jean-Pierre Fuchs, and Gustavo Badel, many others. So I guess you could say it worked. He was able to beat much bigger guys than him, but it didn't look aesthetic at all. It looked obvious, and he didn't like it, and that's the reason why he didn't keep competing afterwards. Cedric Mcmillan. Now this guy, you would say that he's an absolute genetic freak. And he is. He has the symmetry, he has the proportions, he has the skeletal structure, he has everything, but his problem, his weakness was, now it's obviously not, but at one point I'm sure he thought that it was the ability to gain muscle fast, because at the age of 25, he didn't look super impressive. He looked pretty small, right? But he kept training, he kept pushing everything, and eventually he grew. He overcame that. So it probably wasn't a problem, but he didn't know at that point. I'm sure he thought that he didn't have good genetics for growth, and apparently it wasn't the case because he kept pushing and eventually he grew, and now he's as big as a house and he has everything else. He just can't really get super conditioned. If he gets that, eventually he's gonna become the next Mr. Olympia winner easily. Everybody knows that. Hopefully he will do that someday, but let's not talk about that anymore. Let's go to the next bodybuilder. That's gonna be Jay Cutler. Now Jay, in my opinion, one of the best genetics of all time. He had pretty much everything. Very, very complete physique. However, his weakness was his bone structure. He was always a huge guy. He had pretty big bones and also he had big waist. That was the weakness. But he was so wide through his shoulders and he was able to pack so much mass that you couldn't really notice that his waist was a bit bigger. Now everybody knows, of course, everybody can see it, yeah, but at the stage it wasn't super obvious, it wasn't really a weakness. So by adding so much mass and growing super big shoulders and by being so wide in his overall upper body and by having huge legs, he kind of made the illusion of having normal sized waist, not a small waist. But he overcame this flaw by gaining so much muscle, by being an absolute mass monster. Phil Heath, yeah, the gift. I'm sure most of you would think he has no weaknesses. At his prime, he pretty much didn't have any. But before his prime, back in 2008, 2010, there was a weakness that everybody thought was pretty much unfixable. Most people thought that he wouldn't be able to beat Jay because of this thing. And maybe he wouldn't if Jay wasn't injured in 2011, but eventually he would beat him and he would reign for quite a few years because he fixed the problem. The problem was his narrow shoulders. He was really narrow upstairs and that kind of hurt his back. It hurt his front double bicep pose. It was obvious that he was narrow through the shoulders and that was his skeletal structure. And that's something you cannot change. You cannot change it, absolutely. But what you can do is create an illusion, which is exactly what he did. He worked super hard on his delts. His delts grew so much. His back wasn't wide because of that structure, but he gained so much muscle on it that it was super 3D. And it looked big. His small waist also made it seem like he had a good V taper and he would stretch those lats. He would lean backwards, he would create such a great illusion, but by having that 3D effect, so much muscle popping everywhere, it created an illusion of having a big, wide back. Even though it was narrow, he created it big. He made it big by adding so much mass in shoulders, in back, in arms, and also forearms. So he overall gained muscle everywhere, and after everything was complete, after his project was finished in 2011, it was perfect physique, pretty much, you can call it. As perfect as it gets. The next one is Sean Roden. Now this guy, an absolute freak, just like everybody else at that Mr. Olympia level. Everybody is, of course. But he didn't have good arms, good chest, good back, compared to the reigning champion, Phil Heath. So what did he do? Well, he was big, don't get me wrong, he had everything. He did have arms, he did have back, he did have chest, but it was just much smaller than Phil Heath's. He did have great legs though, probably better than Phil's. His glutes were absolutely outstanding, insane, but his upper body wasn't matching Phil's. So he did come big and full, but he came absolutely ripped. He came super conditioned, and that's how he was able to beat the most genetically blessed bodybuilder of all time, Phil Heath, by bringing the conditioning and good legs as well. And on the opposite side of the spectrum, you have Brandon Curry, who has probably the worst legs of any Mr. Olympia ever. Let's say proportionally speaking, probably the old school guys had smaller legs than him, of course, if you just measure them. But compared to his upper body, his legs, his lower body was just not up to par. But what he did was he came super full. He came with having an insane upper body Great arms, great back, great chest, and not really conditioned, super conditioned, but he was polished, he was really full, he was just better than everybody else, and that was his game. And even though he didn't have good legs, nobody else was better than him that night, and that's how he became the Mr. Olympia. And I also have to mention the classic physique Mr. Olympia champion Chris Bumstead, who has really horrible arm genetics, but he has everything else but that. And even in some poses like front double bicep, where your focus is on the biceps, his physique looks amazing because he has everything else. Great V-taper, great legs, great chest, great lats, great vacuum, overall structure is amazing. Arms, not that good, but he was able to focus on everything else to show us his strengths and win that Mr. Olympia title absolutely deservedly. So that's gonna do it for this list, guys. You tell me if you think I forgot somebody important. I'm sure it happened. If you did, tell me down below in the comment section. If you want to say anything about this video, please comment. Like the video if you enjoyed it, and if you want to see more bodybuilding videos like this, you know what to do. Subscribe to this channel, guys. All the best and keep it old school.